So this is a question to the panel. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of Pacific 2 Nations?
In 2011, we were attending a conference. Some of us were attending a conference out in South Auckland, and what became evident was there was a lack of representation of Pacific Island people. And so as we were talking together after lunch with Pastor Louis and some other Pacific Island pastors and a few Palangi pastors as well, we realised that there was a massive gap there. And so out of that came a desire to do something about it. And so in 2012, we officially begun Pacific 2 Nations with the express purpose of mobilising Pacific Island people for global missions.
We realised that in this meeting there were very, very few brown faces. It was pretty much white faces, and it was like, man, there's a real gap here that needs to be fulfilled. So a group of us got together and we discussed the real need to be able to mobilise the Polynesian, Micronesian and Melanesian churches, because it seemed that they'd stalled, and we didn't want to form an agency. We realised that God was initiating something fresh, and it was like a movement. And jump forward, we realised that God was stretching us beyond our capacity, and he challenged us to hire a facility to draw people together, and it was in South Auckland. And the Lord told us to go to a neutral venue, not a church. And so we ended up hiring the Vodafone Centre in South Auckland, and we want it to become free for people to come to. Not even gold coin connections or anything like that. And long story short, this auditorium got filled with people, and altar calls. Young people were just so desirous to get on board with the Great Commission. And a few years later, the Lord challenged us to do something similar, and this time, full auditorium again, arena in South Auckland, and pastors were saying, man, we've dropped the ball, we really need to get involved in the Great Commission. But this has spread way beyond South Auckland here in New Zealand. It went right around the Pacific Rim, into Sydney, right up into the heart of America, through Seattle, San Diego, Los Angeles. These people were capturing the need for the Polynesian, Micronesian, Melanesian churches to get involved in the Great Commission. So that started the genesis of Pacific 2 Nation.
P2N is not a new idea. P2N, the desire of our leaders was to see our own Pacific people rise up again, like before in the early 1800s. When the gospel arrived in the Pacific, the desire was to take the gospel to other nations of the Pacific, all the way up to Papua New Guinea. So this is not a new thing. It's a new way of doing things, but it's the same thing. It is the fulfillment of the Great Commission. And so the heart of P2N, or Pacific 2 Nations, is to recapture the same fire that was in our forefathers when they took the gospel to other nations. And we're hoping that through Pacific 2 Nations, young people and churches will once again see the need, see the heart of the Lord to spread the gospel to the nations.
Can you just give us an idea on an example of a mission or work that has come through the Pacific 2 Nations? I know there's a lot, but can you give me a couple?
We've had a lot of teams gone to many nations, basically all over the world, smaller teams, short-term mission teams. Our desire is to see more long-term teams go out to the nations. But we've gone to Asia, Pacific, and these are not Pacific 2 Nations teams. These are teams from churches. So Pacific 2 Nations is not a mission agency, as been mentioned before. We operate slightly different. Our focus is church-centered, is to encourage, train, mobilize the churches to get involved in missions, and not necessarily Pacific 2 Nations doing the mission work for the church. So we've had several teams that have gone to Brazil, to Chile, Argentina, teams in Papua, Indonesia. I don't know how many teams have gone to Indonesia. I don't know. Middle East, Europe, Africa. So teams have gone out all over the place. Yeah.
We talked about how the gospel was well received in the Pacific, but can you tell me some of the reasons why it was well received, and how it spread so rampant?
Some of the books that have been written definitely from a Palangi Pakeha perspective, but in the midst of some of those writings and those books, there's also become available of very much of what the Pacific Island people had been doing. And one of the things that stood out for me was the incredible passion and dedication that they showed. And sometimes they would pass away, sometimes it was through martyrdom, they were killed, sometimes through sickness and disease. And what they would do is when that news got back to their village in Samoa or Tonga or the Cook Islands or wherever, immediately the families would offer their other children. And instead of just one person replacing the person who had passed away, sometimes they would plead for 2 or 3. So that sort of zeal, not put off by the fact that it was hard and lives got lost and journeys were difficult, conditions were difficult, even reception by people at times was hostile. So yes, overall there was receptivity to the gospel, but some of those places were still hostile, not only to the European missionaries, but even to missionaries coming from Pacific Island cultures. But because of that zeal and dedication and passion coming out of their love for God, it penetrated island after island, village after village, right through the Pacific.
You know, I think the simplicity of the gospel wasn't like rocket science. You know, these people understood the gospel for what it was. They didn't have to have theological training or license to do anything. They just wanted to share their faith with people, and it was very simple to go to other villages, certainly to other islands, but then they realised, hey, they couldn't keep it to themselves. So I guess led by the Holy Spirit, they went to other nations, and as Graham said, yeah, a lot of people were martyred on the journey. They knew there was a price to be paid, but the exciting thing is the gospel wasn't kept to themselves. They responded diligently, and I guess even now when we look at modern history, there's a fresh call, you know, to go again, and that's part of the P2N mandate, I guess, is to stir up the flame again. And so we can see people responding to the gospel, and we have seen it, but that first generation responded diligently because they heard and they responded to the obedience of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, that leads me to the next question. I mean, this is the mid-19th century, and can you tell me what has happened after that? Why has the ball been dropped in terms of the Great Commission, especially in the Pacific nations?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why we don't see a whole lot of missional activities in the Pacific churches today, I guess one of the things is that we've lost the passion, the zeal for the gospel. There's so many other church activities happening, but the main thing of the command of Jesus for the church to go into the nations, that's kind of ignored in some ways by the church. But the other thing is a whole lot of other things have happened. The rise of higher knowledge and missions has been reduced to activities like education and building church buildings instead of frontline gospel proclamation. So probably one of the other things that happened in the mid-1900s was the number of Pacific missionaries that have died on the field. And so there was this pressure from the United Nations on the LMS, the Palangi mission organizations, with the way that they are handling fatality on the field. And so in some ways, that has caused the drop in the number of missionaries from the islands to go overseas.
Yeah, even theologically, there was false information shared that the job had been done, that they'd fulfilled the Great Commission, even though there were literally hundreds of nations yet to hear the gospel and to have multiplying churches in their midst, self-propagating churches in their midst. They were told that the job had been done, so they began to take the foot off the mission, global mission, emphasis that they had been carrying out successfully throughout the Pacific. And so that was a false assumption, and they even stopped training people in that missions area, which was a real tragedy. And so Pacific to Nations is about, as we've been repeating, it's about stirring that legacy up and the incredible suitability of Pacific peoples for missions.
One of the main reasons, I think, why the baton was dropped from one generation to the next was the fact that many of our pastors were never trained in mission. They'd probably never even been to Bible college, and some of them had gone to Bible college if they were really lucky, but most of them were never trained. And even when they went to Bible college, they were never trained in the Great Commission or mission. And so there was an incredible blind spot being created. So you go one generation, 2 generations, 3 generations out, this bigger blind spot became bigger and bigger. So we've got this new generation that never really understood the responsibility of the Great Commission and carry the Great Commission, and now it's like, oops, we're discovering there's an incredible void, and the question is, how do we respond to that incredible void?